Good morning. If you look at your own watches and mobile phones, you will see that this clock is not. So we decided to start in between the real time and this clock. So I have the very big pleasure to introduce the second keynote speaker of this conference, Professor Dinesh Bhugra. And now I will read some facts. He's yeah, it's very long, so yeah, you might want to sit down. He's Emeritus Professor of Mental Health and Cultural Diversity at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London, and the past President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and current President of the World Psychiatric Association for this was passed, right? Has been the President of the World Psychiatric Association. And then I know that you also have a huge number of publications, papers, book chapters and books and many other important scientific contributions. And apart from that, I can also reveal that you're one of my big inspirations for this field, and I'm so happy that you said yes to come here. If I turn my head at the same time, you can't hear me. So and when we met the other day, I just checked in with you. That's something that I often quote you for, was more or less what you have said, and I think you confirmed it. And it's about knowing one's own prejudices and accepting that we all have them. Which I think is an important part of the work that we do, and not necessarily being able to fight all of them if we have many, but at least I think you say that we all have at least one, so get to know them and then be aware of them when you move around. And then you can correct me now in your lecture if that was wrong or too much. So a very warm welcome, Dinesh.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Yeah, great. Thanks for the invitation, Jessica, and particularly grateful to Anna and Amila for all your help behind the scenes. It is a great honor to be here in the first conference and to be able to talk about something which has been bugging me, I think, over the last few years, because we use terms like racism and we use terms like misogyny and other terms, but what do they mean? And one of the things that sort of fascinates me is that how we see the world and how the world sees us. And that, you could argue that what's that to do with psychiatry? And partly that stigma that people with mental illnesses face, people who work in the field face, somehow that if you go into psychiatry, certainly when I did, people thought I was crazy myself. And maybe I was looking for a solution. And maybe I was, and I haven't found it yet. But it's also, I'm really grateful to be here in this kind of unique center which brings together culture and mind. And I don't know how you managed it, but you got the beautiful weather as well. What's the secret? Can I take it back to London? We know, and people kind of make assumptions about what we understand by race. It's been argued that it is biological, it's genetic, it's physical characteristics, physical potential, physical predisposition. And people who then use that variable as a way of gaining certain privileges. And that is what racism is about. But I want us to spend some time in the discussion, and I promise I'll leave about 15 minutes for discussion, because this is something that I'm struggling with 40 years on as to what it means. And although, I mean, people argue that race is a social construct which goes back to colonial times, I think it predates that. It predates that partly because it's to do with otherism, how we create the other. And it is that in the colonial times it became much more because the colonialists, and certainly East India Company was a classic example of neoliberal capitalism, controlling all kinds of resources, controlling workforce, controlling who worked, who did not, destroying a lot of heritage in the countries that the colonial powers occupied. And it is that identification of us versus them, these natives who do not deserve these privileges, but we do. And that raises some sort of fascinating questions. It's about indicating that superiority. But superior race deserves privileges. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Cicero, 100 BC, in a letter to Atticus. He writes, do not get slaves from Britain because they are stupid, lazy, and incapable of learning. And what's more, they don't understand music. Now, you could argue, is that racism? Is that a kind of real observation? Is it something else? And again, it is that the idea of the other based on physical characteristics has been there in Roman and Greek times. So, slavery existed in both those times. People with darker skins were called people with burnt faces. And it raises some fascinating question. And then you kind of get into this genetic bit that all these differences are genetic, and therefore the whole concept in early 20th century America and New England in the 1910, so on and so forth, about genetic superiority and inferiority, and which then gets picked up by the Nazis. And, so it's a kind of ongoing story. And people were identifying people by virtue of geography as well as physical characteristics. And then it was sort of clans, communities, tribes, languages spoken. And certainly when I was growing up in India, there was a skin cream called Himalayan snow, which was advertised very widely, which was sold very widely to lighten people's skin colors. Because people with lighter color in the Indian hierarchy was seen as superior. And particularly because Brahmins had lighter colors and lower castes did not. And so there was a kind of automatic assumption. And that continues even now. Until about 3 years ago, there used to be a cream marketed, supported by lots of Bollywood actors, called Fair and Handsome and Fair and Lovely. So Fair and Lovely for women and Fair and Handsome for men, to lighten. And again, same things happen in Jamaica and South Africa. And that kind of allows people to play that role, something which is visible and gives them certain powers and privileges. Until 1965, in the USA, interracial marriages were not allowed because it was, white blood was not to be tainted by black blood. 1965. So that's 57 years ago. And we know, there's considerable evidence that the racial distinctions, as, I've talked about, are not genetically discrete. They're not reliable. They're not scientifically useful, but people still use them. And I'll come back to this whole notion of micro-identities, which is about that, sexual orientation is one identity, gender is another, religion is another, and, how we deal with that. But there is distinction between race and ethnicity, and certainly in the UK, ethnicity is self-defined. And it also amuses me that you have black British and you have Indians. Now, black British relies on skin color, Indian relies on geographical context. So how can you compare the two? And yet somehow they're kind of treated as categories which we're all expected to answer in the census and in various forms and so on and so forth. So we also know that, again, the founder of American psychiatry, Benjamin Rush, had slaves, and he described if the slave wanted to run away, it was a psychiatric disorder called drapetomania. So you can't, hold this mirror to the society and say, well, this is, nothing to do with me. This is a historical baggage. And WHO defines racism as that there's an inherent connection between perceived hereditary and cultural traits, and some groups see themselves as superior to others. And when I first went to the UK 40-something years ago, don't want to give my age away, and I thought that it was a meritocratic society. It is to a certain degree, but not beyond. Beyond that, it sort of really, one of the deputy prime ministers under John Major, Michael Heseltine, was criticized that he had to buy his own furniture, that he hadn't inherited, for several centuries. So old money versus new money, which club you belong to, which university you went to, all those subtle influences are very much in place and people take it for granted. And prejudice is the negative attitudinal, behavioral, and emotional set against an individual, a situation, a group, based purely on selected social or cultural characteristics. And ethnocentrism is when we see my culture is superior, is overvalued compared to anybody else. And therefore that leads to biased judgments. So racism has been described as a consistent, constant pattern of prejudice and discrimination. But quite often we do not link race with class or educational systems. Britain has a Hindu prime minister, went to public school, I think went to Oxford, worked in the city, made his 40 millions, and then married somebody richer than he is. Now, his experience of racism, how's that comparable to people we see in clinics? And so quite often we forget that the role class, social status, educational status play in these kind of multiple levels. So again, I'm not going to go through that, but again, ethnic prejudice is fairly similar, but it is placing the disadvantaged group at a considerable disadvantage, and you gain the advantages yourself. So use your position. And I see more and more in the last 3 years, particularly in the UK. I don't know how much you know of the corruption and the scandals with the ruling party. Contracts were given to provide completely useless PPE and other things to the NHS. People made billions out of it. Now, that's in a way taking advantage of your position. Now, is it ethnic? Is it racial? Or is it simply economic? And again, I hope we can sort of spend some time discussing that. And even within the same group, there are issues to do with otherism and racism. And individual racism does not occur in a social, institutional, or psychological vacuum. So we need all those, and we need to be thinking about what that means, and I'll come back to that. So it's quite clear that particularly in Latin America, um, even within Latin America, there are strata of privilege, and so people above look down upon, because that's kind of who we are and what our nature is. 87 types of racism have been described in literature, and there's focus on individuals, focus on systems, etc. But two I just want to touch upon before moving on to otherism. One is missionary racism, which is very much that I know what's good for you, you poor thing, you can't think for yourself. So I will make decisions, and particularly, the imposition of my worldview on yours, pretending or not necessarily acknowledging, but pretending that you don't have a worldview, you can't think for yourself. And then the other one is color blindness. It really annoys me. Lots of things annoy me. As I was saying yesterday, I'm a grumpy old man. Color blindness basically means that I see everybody equal. No, I don't want you to see everybody equal. I want you to see people as they are, different. The difference between equality and equity, I think, is incredibly important. A simple example, equality is, I give everybody sitting in this room a pair of shoes. I've done my duty. I've treated you all equally. Whether the shoes fit or not is not my problem. I've given you the shoes. Equity means that I give you the shoes which fit you and which meet your needs. So if you want a pair of shoes with kind of high heel, then I should be able to give it to you. And for me, that's the crux of equity when we talk about equity between mental health and physical health, between races. That's what it is about, that you bring people things they need, they can work on. The other problem that we quite often have is institutional racism. And as I said earlier, that in India particularly, the caste system is institutionalized, and it's quite fascinating that I did not know, but I was reading about it quite recently, that Martin Luther King went to India and understood the caste system and said that's exactly what we are experiencing in the USA. A recent book by a black author from America has come out called Caste, and she talks about how the system works in both in individual racism and institutional racism. Institutional racism is, in its infinite wisdom, the current government in the UK about 3 years ago decided that it did not believe in institutional racism, that it did not exist. So, when you're sleeping and you put a sheet over your head, you could be anywhere, nothing else exists. So that was the process. And particularly in healthcare systems, and this whole argument that people are coming over, storming, they'll run down our health services and demands, is utter nonsense. And that's partly because we've got this privilege, we don't want to share it with anyone else. We know that there are no pure genes, and linking race with IQ is racist in itself, and we know that. I'm not going to go through that. But the structural racism has become a political tool, certainly in the UK, because the right-winger Tories have persuaded the government to say that it doesn't happen. And similarly, I mean, if you look at, I don't know, again, you've been following the stories in the UK, there is a club called Garrick Club, which is until about last week did not allow women as its members. Nobody knows why. And suddenly there was a big hoo-ha and they changed the rules. Now, and some very eminent authors have objected to it. Now, I can't understand the rationale. Maybe that means that if they have women in the club, they'll have to behave themselves. I don't know. Maybe they did not have strict enough nannies. And again, there's a question of class that comes in. And we know, clubs have rules, who's allowed in, who's not allowed in, and we can have a debate. And certainly, both in the USA and UK, there is a hierarchy. Did you go to an Ivy League school? Did you go to Oxbridge? And if you went to Birmingham or you went to Durham, not the same thing. So it is, the health disparities are to do with access to healthcare, socioeconomic status, social determinants, which in turn are influenced by geopolitical determinants, and I'll come back to that. I think I'm going to sort of skip some of these and move on to the other. The other is about the self is possible only through the recognition of the other. The terms other or others can be understood in all kinds of ways, meanings, context to distinguish gender, generation, nationality, religion, and so on. And part of the reason for creation of the other is us versus them, me versus you. I am who I am because you are not who I am. And it is central to sociological analysis of how minority and majority identities are constructed, and within a group which has the power, which is kind of related to the idea of privilege, and I'll come back to that. So social identities are created through our ongoing social interactions with people and our self-reflection. So who we think we are according to these social exchanges and agreement, disagreement, negotiation with other people. So, feedback on this lecture will be highly valued. So the other creates all these feelings of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, misogyny, which all then lead to stigma and discrimination. So the identity of who we are depends on a number of things that, dictionary definition suggests identity of the fingerprints on the gun. He began to doubt his own identity. And particularly in a psychiatric context, that becomes quite important, particularly if your identity is purely as a refugee and nothing else. And that's how you're being seen. So who a person is, what a thing is, the qualities, beliefs, it may be mistaken identity, male gender identity, immigrants with strong ethnic identities, sense of self, and identity of interests. So how I see myself, how I see others seeing me, how I see you seeing me, and then I rethink, readjust my thinking and my identity. We think that these are innate. They're not. Some of these we learn. Some of these we change as we grow along. So there is individual identity, cultural identity, social identity, and professional, and it can work at various, cultural, tribal, professional levels and roots, etc. Now, just right at the top, this is a pyramid. right at the top is a mosaic of micro-identities. So I'm going to move away from the microphone for a second. So this could be gender, religion, sexual orientation, age, profession, etc. So depending upon where the light shines and the context, one bit may light up, 2 bits may light up, but not the whole thing. And there may be within that mosaic things that you can hide. You can hide your sexual orientation unless you're wearing certain religious facts. You know, if you're wearing a turban or you're wearing a yamulke, you can hide your religion. You may not be able to hide your gender. You may not be able to hide your disability, but you certainly can hide your profession. And so what that means is that we show these identities at different times to different people depending upon the context. And that makes it fascinating because I am who I am all the time in my view, but the way you see me can vary depending on what I choose to show you. I could have come in a skirt with a wig and, pretended, I'm not who I am. And people do, particularly at Halloween and fancy dress parties and so on and so forth. So what's that about? And that identity is personal, but it's also linked with family and community, tribe, social identity, and then the cultural identity. And these can be kind of interlinked, interdigitated in a fascinating way. And that's sort of, there's a rootedness about cultural, social, personal, and professional identities. So what we know is that the otherism, when people focus on racism, it is more than simple racism. It's more than race. It may be other factors that we don't think about, that people may be objecting to, that there may be underlying misogyny, there may be underlying anti-Semitism, but it gets subsumed under racism. And the problem with using a very narrow definition is that it ignores other factors. And particularly in the terms of identity, we need to be very conscious of what other factors are and what roles they play. And that takes me to the unconscious attitudes and behavior we all have, which, what Jessica was talking about earlier in terms of prejudices, that we all have multiple prejudices, at least one, if not more. What that does is that irrespective of knowledge, some of those beliefs are very deep rooted. And, no amount of logic can shift that, because that's the prejudice and that's the prejudicial behavior. And within an institution, that bias is about gaining and retaining power, and that may be professional, that in certain settings, a consultant psychiatrist may think that, I am the leader of the team and you will do, you're merely a nurse and you will do what I want you to do. So that bullying, harassment, and discrimination then come into play in the kind of institutional context. So I'm not giving you simple answers. I'm actually making it more complicated, because it is, and we need to be thinking about those kind of social factors and determinants. And social determinants, as we saw that beautiful slide yesterday from Australia, that social determinants affect political determinants, etc. And for me, it's also related to commercial, political, geographical, cultural determinants which impact upon people's mental health. And at each of those levels, idea of privilege, control, and subjugation of the other becomes incredibly important. Both institutional and individual racism can lead to stereotyping. We just think all 1.4 billion Indians smell of curry. End of story. Whether they like curry or not doesn't matter. Rejection. You are not who I am, and therefore I'm going to reject you. I want to mix with my own kind. Prejudices, as I said, and devaluing other cultures, but also in a funny kind of way, devaluing your own cultural values. In clinical settings, this otherism is particularly important because quite often when the patient comes to us, we see them for an hour and then half an hour every 2 weeks, 4 weeks, every week, whatever. For that period in our room, our identity is that of a clinician and theirs is that of a patient. And very often we forget that as the person walks out of the room, their identity changes. They're somebody's mother, father, brother, sister, wife, husband, a worker, a leader, a teacher. And in that half an hour, in that consultation, that light is focusing just on them as a patient. And that's something that we need to be conscious of, that when that happens, where do we go beyond that? And in many settings, it can lead to multiple misdiagnoses because we don't really understand. And again, we touched upon disease versus illness yesterday, that, we as clinicians are interested in diseases, patients are interested in illnesses, which means that disease is affecting their social function. But it also means that because of our prejudicial attitudes, we underdiagnose certain conditions. And that's particularly important when we are working with interpreters, that quite often interpreters from the same culture may want to hide the shame of illness in the culture. So they may feel, this doesn't happen in our culture, and therefore, and that's again another form of otherism within that context. And then, of course, there are culture-bound syndromes, which again fascinates me because in about 50 years ago, there were about 190 something culture-bound syndromes in DSM-3, DSM-2, DSM-3, and in the last DSM-5, there are only 5. So what's happened to them? What has changed? And of course, in terms of management, there are challenges. We may use research tools which are inappropriate, but they've been confirmed in one culture, and we just kind of blindly use them into another. We may use wrong values, wrong dosages of medications, and different kinds of therapies which don't work. So there is racism and poor mental health, particularly for suicidal ideation, suicidal attempt, and for affective and psychotic disorders and substance use disorders. Now, what I want you to sort of think about is it can't be seen in isolation. It has to be seen in conjunction with the physical health. So we know, certainly there's masses of data from the UK which shows that migrants are quite often unlikely to be investigated for physical conditions, unlikely to be treated, delays in seeking treatment, in providing treatment, and therefore poorer outcomes, higher rates of certain conditions. So it may be that, as Paradis and colleagues have talked about, these discriminatory experiences lead to heightened stress response. And we know about minority stress and minority stress response and mental illnesses. And I've touched upon that, so I'm not going to go through that again. We know that services are not going to be used rapidly. And I think I do apologize. I may have duplicated some of the slides in my excitement. Maybe some things are worth saying twice. And I mean, I've already told you one of the things that sort of irritates me. The another thing that really gets my goat is health is seen in isolation. It's about education, it's about employment, it's about housing, it's about a whole load of other things that we have no power over, so we don't think about it. And so how do we bring that about? And it's about, poor housing, poor education, not having enough resources, which leads to poor employment, which leads to stress, lack of money, etc. So we need to be thinking about joined up between various points. And there is this whole, and I've talked about missionary racism, and I think I'm going to skip that as well. But as a clinician, we need to look at our own prejudices and unconscious biases. We do stereotype other cultures. I'm not saying stereotypy by itself is a bad thing, because it's a shortcut. And that's what we should remember, that it remains a shortcut and we are kind of jumping. And the marginalization leads to a whole host of, we shutter thinking. We don't understand that, there are low adherence to medication in minority groups. Is it because they're suspicious of what we are giving them? Is it because they have different models that, medication has certain purpose? As I was saying earlier, at the unit on Wednesday, that, some cultures prefer injections, others prefer big pills, some prefer blue pills, some like red pills. And when people stop taking their medication, we never ask them as to why did you stop. We just assume that, they had side effects and, and obviously there are differences in diet, nutrition, body mass, and linked to substances, which we don't take into account either. We don't titrate the dosages. And for a very long time, drug trials were being conducted in white populations, and we were using those dosages for minority groups. Not surprisingly, they were getting sort of more side effects. Now more and more drug trials are being conducted in, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Far East Asia. So it'll be interesting to see how those doses are then applied to the white population. And we know that there are many groups who would be using complementary alternative medicines, which we don't understand. We either think that they are kind of very primitive. Again, it was quite interesting to hear the Australian experience yesterday, that the interaction between complementary and alternative medicine and what we prescribe can be quite problematic. And is it because we are unaware? Is it because we have that prejudice or unconscious bias? And we know, again, that most Western psychotherapies are ego-based, which may not work, and there may be questions about racial transference and racial countertransference. And one of the speakers mentioned that yesterday from his experience in the Tavistock. So it raises some fascinating questions about how we create the other, how we manage that otherism, and how we should we be using indigenous therapies by adopting them. And one of the things that I haven't touched upon is racial life events. We know that life events lead to depression, that interpretation of that life event, whether it is seen as racial, can cause problems. I did not get a job because, and there's been some interesting work done in the UK about where they've changed the names with the same CV, changed the names of the candidates, and a white sounding name person has been shortlisted, and a black sounding name, I don't know how you can, how name sounds black, but you know what I mean. And it raises interesting questions about how we change that perception and how we deal with that. And we know that, there's work done by Krebenden and Jim Van Os in the Netherlands on a systematic review. They showed that it's not only the discrimination which causes stress and therefore psychiatric disorders, but it's also the perception of discrimination. And that kind of links in quite neatly, in my view, with the perception of otherism. So if I am kind of perceiving something which is affecting my identity or functioning, then what does that mean and how do I deal with it? So these, plus lack or presence of mediating support such as social support and internal mediating factors will influence stress and create problems. So thank you once again for being here and listening. So I have left 15 minutes for discussion because I really want to kind of hear your views about, am I talking nonsense? Or have I talked nonsense?
So we have time for questions. That's wonderful. And I have a microphone that might work. After a while, yeah. So, oh, sorry.
This microphone.
Okay. Oh, I have this one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. I think you make a really strong point about the thing about asking people and being curious also, because I'm a clinician. So for me as a clinician, I think it's really important always, no matter if it's someone of my own kind of ethnic background, but people are different, as you say, and no matter who is in front of me, I think it's really important that we are curious and dare, you can say, to be curious about what people are thinking and wanting. You mentioned, for example, that people would like sometimes psychologists or psychiatrists from their own ethnic background. We often experience quite the opposite, because communities here are small. It's a small country, so people are afraid, for example, if you have a counselor from your own background, that they might go back to society and tell about them. So I think it's really important that we not kind of just presume that we know what people want, but stay curious all the time. So that was just a comment about that.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's always better to ask than not to ask. The challenge in terms of matching, I mean, because as a clinician, you have certain power in the context of your culture, professionalization, qualifications, etc. And sometimes in those settings, the transference and counter-transference become much more difficult to identify and handle, because this kind of thing is not seen in our culture. So you kind of shut the doors. But equally importantly, I think sometimes that kind of initial engagement can help, and in subsequent sessions things can open up and things can become much more clear.
So, thank you. And then we have a question from over here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the good, insightful presentation. I come to annoy you because I come back to the concept that annoying, that makes you to feel annoyed. This is
Concept of?
that help you to feel annoyed. So it's the concept of blindness of car. And then I was thinking, because there is, I have also medical background, and I know there is a disorder which is called cara blindness, which means you are not able to distinguish the colors. And what do you do when you use cara blindness as a symptom or a sign of racism? And what don't you do if you are not racist? This is my first question. Another question is about, I think we, in the before us slide, they will, which I like very much, we cultural scientists, we say always that psychotherapies from Europe are ego-based and not cultural context. But to date, I think, why do we use them? I think they are cultural contextualized by West. But I think we can, what do you think if we find concept which says like, we do not have in our context and we need to develop. But then we are using those as substitutes in between. But we lack those, cultural-based interventions, but Western-based intervention are cultural contextualized in their context where they have been developed. I think I annoyed you a lot, and thank you very much.
I don't think you have at all. You must try again. I think it has, taking your second point first, several anthropologists have argued that psychology itself is a Western phenomenon. It sort of came from the West and it kind of being imposed under the guise of global mental health into everywhere else. And cultures are sociocentric and egocentric. Classically, they are masculine and feminine. They are linear active. They are multi-active. They are loose. They are tight. So there are different classifications of cultures. Now, that is not to say that every person in that particular culture is going to be exactly like that. Every person coming from a sociocentric culture where the identity is not I, but we, in the tribe, in the extended community, in the extended family, is not going to be sociocentric. So that's one thing. The second thing, in that context, what we need to be aware of is that there is evidence that in certain settings, family therapy works better in some cultures than in others. Cognitive behavior therapy works better in some cultures but not in others. So there is that distinction that we need to be conscious of and not say that everybody is egocentric and therefore they deserve egocentric treatment. I keep going back to the point that it's the person sitting in front of us and we need to know what their needs are, what best meets their needs to provide what will get them better. What is it that they want? And can we provide it? And if not, why not? So we need to look at that. And and again, I use the example that if you, certainly looking at the research data in the UK, if you are an egocentric person from a sociocentric society migrating to an egocentric country, surrounded by egocentric people, you're much more likely to settle down more rapidly. If you're an egocentric person from a sociocentric society moving into an egocentric society, but surrounded by sociocentric people, you're more likely to get conflict. And there is fair bit of research evidence to say that those kind of settings do produce higher rates of psychiatric disorders. So putting that to one side, this first point that you made, yes, color blindness is an illness, and maybe I should have specified that this is the therapist's color blindness, not physical color blindness, but seeing everybody equal, not taking into account their individual needs. That's the point I was making. Maybe I should have been clearer, and I'll change that slide. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Andreas Merger.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind of very comprehensive overview about racism and otherism. I may add something that is probably it entails more the new challenges, I think, because I think racism is already known since 100 years or so as a big thing we all have to battle, and in ourselves as well. In looking for cultural dimensions like the Hofstede did and others, there was a team from China, Leong and Bond. They had 5 dimensions for cultural differences, and one is social cynicism. People and even in cultures differ in their degree of social cynicism, meaning that they think differences are justified and superiority is justified. Superiority belongs to people who are more active, more deserve it. And I think it seems to be a fact, and I think in some countries, like in the UK and in other countries, people with a high degree of social cynicism are taking over increasingly. Actually, another of the 5 dimensions of these very intelligent guys is social complexity. Yeah. And we all differ in or even our cultures or our cultural leaders differ in the degree how to acknowledge how complex a society is. But I'd like to particularly ask you, what will this, I would say, fact of social cynicism differs between not only people, communities, societies, cultures. What will it teach us with regard to what you said?
I think that's a very helpful point, Andreas. Thank you. Because I agree that one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that social complexities are complex. Because societies change, cultures evolve, and things which were commonplace 50 years ago are gone, many of them, and some other complications have emerged. So yes, I would agree. I mean, I wasn't aware of the social cynicism aspect, but I'll go away and have a look at it, because it is going to be absolutely critical, because that feeds into, do I feel part of this society or not? Is it kind of, there have been, studies on sort of self-racism and, kind of self-homophobia and so on and so forth. And so how that fits into a broader model to explore, and that cynicism, is it temporary? Is it now? Is it occasional? Is it permanent? And that's going to sort of impact upon long-term identities and functioning of individuals. So thank you for that.
Then we have a question here in the front.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed your talk. A couple of comments. I think the concept of willful ignorance really feeds into the concept of racism, because I'm just gobsmacked that the UK government, for example, doesn't recognise the institutional racism in the NHS, for example, when the evidence clearly points to the contrary, time and time again. My other comments relate to the binaries, which of course are incredibly powerful and fixed in certain ways in societal structures, and the ways in which we are constantly trying to deconstruct them. But I'm also very mindful that this epistemology and ontology is, as our previous questioners suggested, very Western, and so there is, beautiful anthropological work about the ways in which self and other actually are not understood in that way in other cultures. So I was just thinking about the problems of posing racism with those binaries. At the same time, we're trying to undo those binaries and widen them to think about or to include other ontologies. And my last point was, in hearing you talk and the ways, I really like the ways in which you brought class and classism into these ideas of race and racism. And it makes me think about the French theorist Pierre Bourdieu, who talked a lot about class, because it's about the fields and the struggles and the conflicts and the status and the capital which people have as they're trying to scramble their way in this competitive neoliberal environment to the top. I think there's some room there to actually think about what Bourdieu might offer us if we're thinking about racism in that context.
Thank you very much. The reason I'm smiling is that in a different context, I talk about cultural capital, which is very much based on Bourdieu's work and, the kind of objectives and the new additions to that. And I hadn't considered cultural capital in the context of racism, but I think it's something that, thank you for that. I'm going to go away and look at that, because one of the big challenges is that everybody has cultural capital, and we carry it with us wherever we go. Some bits we kind of try and hide and minimize, and some bits we expand depending upon the context. And that again sort of fits in with the sort of micro-identity model that, which bit we choose to shine the light on and which bit we kind of switch the light off and say, I'm not going to talk about that. And I think I kind of started off with a very simple idea, and it's becoming more and more complex. So, thank you.
So, Amila, do we have time for one last question, or was that? I'm asking. a short one? A very short. There was one, I think it was over. I think you were first, Maria, I don't know. Anyone who has a short one? I'm sorry. You can talk. We will have a break then, and then there will be time for...
Spoil my coffee.
Yeah, spoil Dinesh's coffee. He's offered it. Oh, sorry, Peter, I didn't see you.
Just to echo the point that you made about class, okay? One of the things that strikes me listening to you is the way in which racism is an active process of self-reproduction, okay? It's a procedure which generates itself and which is generated by the structures around it. And I think that those class structures that you mentioned are a very important part of that. And the particular example I'm thinking of is a sociological study that was done very recently was about the northern parts of England where there were the coal fields, which, of course, as we all know, switched very suddenly to vote for a completely different party in a way that kind of made no sense to many people looking at it for the first time. But the thing was, when you dig into what those societies were and what their experiences were, and the ways in which they were struggling, not to rise, but simply to survive, yeah. Right? So maybe this is also an aspect of this self-generating process of racism that I think we also need to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, very helpful.
So thank you, Dinesh Bhugra, again for this wonderful talk. And now a brief break.